नमस्कारम मित्रों, आज हम आपको we'll teach you about meaningful questions. And here's the deal with meaningful questions. If you ask a meaningful question that makes the other person think, that makes the other person search in themselves to find an answer, they're hooked to you. So instead of saying, where did you go to school? Be like, how was your school experience in like 10th, 11th grade? Now it's going to make them go back in their head and look for all these memories, and this will be the first time they'll be sharing those memories with you. Or uska na ek, there is a different feel to that. There's a different like knowing each other feel to that. But again, मेरी dates से तो मेरे पास कोई recording है नहीं, तो I'm gonna show you a clip that I have with Jesai Deepak. A lot of people know Jesai Deepak. He is a very prominent, let's say, speaker on the Indic politics side, which is popular as the right-wing politics in India. He's a phenomenal guy. Background check kar lena iska. But I asked Jesai halfway through the interview. He's been telling me about Indic politics, and suddenly I ask him a question, right? And the question is meaningful, and you see how much he will engage. The clip is 11 minutes long. You will see how much he engages with this. Watch this.
No, I mean, it sounds pretty amazing. You know, it sounds you're a very passionate speaker, and I'm convinced, but I'm also a little anxious. And by this caricatured question, by the means of this caricatured question, I'm trying to bring out this common anxiety I'm sure a lot of people will face when they hear you. It's like, this is too radical. Like, we're finally making progress on giving women equal rights. We're finally making progress on 377, right? Like, you know, this is but what you're saying is too radical. How do I make peace with that? How do I just reinvent?
Because I think the problem, as I said, goes back to education, because we have to point out, यार 377 कब आया? किसने इंट्रोड्यूस किया?
हाँ, हमने तो नहीं किया. हाँ, right.
हमने तो नहीं किया, right? Second, please tell me, is there recorded, documented history of persecution of non-binary gender identities and transgender identities in the Hindu culture? The answer is a no. Okay, you will not find that.
In fact, celebratory. It's celebratory.
Celebratory is one aspect, but most importantly, the reason why it is celebratory is not because they said let's celebrate it, because they said Gio or Gine do.
Right.
Live and let live. Okay. As long as they don't cause any harm, and that is the identity that they're comfortable in, why should we stop, stifle, quell, subdue, or suffocate anyone? That's the basic question that was put. Okay. And if they want a certain form of practice, and if they want institutions which are exclusively dedicated to them, let us give them that space. That has been the approach. So I don't need a lecture on LGBTQ from anyone from the West or the liberal camp. I'm sorry, we have done this way before you. If anything, you come and sit at our feet and we will teach you how to deal with these people. Okay, and what kind of rights you're supposed to give them, how considerate and how passionate you're supposed to be about their rights, and how sensitive you're supposed to be about these rights. Okay, so women rights ki jo baat hai, we have to understand. I think you should just read Max Muller's brilliant short book, India, What It Can Teach Us. Okay. Despite the controversy surrounding his position on India, on the Aryan invasion theory, on racism and everything else, just read that book, because the one thing that he's very clear about is, for a society to continue to retain its moral fabric, despite having been constantly invaded, bullied, massacred, plundered, raped and everything, even in the medieval period, around that period, Hindus were still known for their truthfulness, for their, commitment to justice, for their ability to keep their word in commercial transactions, despite every form of invasion, which effectively shows the strength of the character of this particular civilization. So whatever has happened by way of a parda system, or by way of, let's say, the treatment of women, or giving them a so-called patriarchal protection, okay, is the consequence of women being treated as war booty by the invaders. Okay? You have to ask anyone who's lived as a...
Right. Sorry? You were sort of cutting out. Please go ahead.
So you should ask anyone who's lived under the Nizam as a Hindu. Okay? In Hyderabad. If, let's say, you were walking on the streets and you did not have the parda, and the Nizam's entourage was on the streets, he and his soldiers will pick up women willy-nilly because they believe that they are their property. Okay? And this is during the Nizam period, even in the 1940s, by the way. Imagine what the situation would have been in 1100s, 1200s, 1500s, and 1600s. Okay? Right. So when people talk of the parda system, they don't understand that the impact of these barbaric invasions, which effectively treated women as war booty, has had a significant role to play in how rules were evolved by the society as a response mechanism.
Interesting. But you know what? The fact still remains, like modern India is not, how would you say, is not nice to its transgender community. We relegate them to chakkas and hijras, and they must band together and live together. And you know, like, and it's not just that. Like, we might have been more civilized. We might have been more tolerant, more inclusive back in the day when we had more agency over ourselves. But the modern narrative is convoluted enough to the point where it is very hard to make sense of the ancient narrative, right?
एक बहुत इंटरेस्टिंग चीज़ व्हाट आई वांट टू पॉइंट आउट इन दिस जंक्चर हो क्या रहा है. देखो, मैंने इससे क्वेश्चन पूछा, एक तरीके से इसने क्वेश्चन का आंसर कर दिया. बहुत लोग एट दिस पॉइंट आर लाइक, ठीक है मेरे क्वेश्चन का आंसर हो गया, बट एक्चुअली नहीं हुआ. इफ यू लिसन टू इट केयरफुली, विच इज व्हाट आई पॉइंट आउट, दैट शोज हाउ जेन्युइन द क्वेश्चन इज. मैं पूछना चाह रहा हूं कि तुम्हारी पॉलिटिक्स में LGBT का क्या रोल, क्या पोजीशन रहेगी. तो जब मैंने पूछा तुम्हारी पॉलिटिक्स में LGBT की क्या पोजीशन रहेगी, जैसा ने क्या आंसर दिया कि देखो हम तो हिस्टोरिकली हमारी पॉलिटिक्स में ही जगह. मैंने बोला वो तो फर्क नहीं पड़ता, मेरे को अभी की बात करो. Right, and this is a genuine question. Now let's see क्या होता है.
Right. And so my question is, I can imagine what you were saying as a way of life, and I can be like, let's go back to it.
Right.
But one, that change is too radical. I don't know what looks. The uncertainty is too much for me to be like, okay, let's get on board with JSI. And on the other hand, there is a question that, you know, is this ancient narrative only romanticized, or is there genuine merit to this narrative that we, you know, pat ourselves for?
Right. There is a brilliant thing about language is that it hides a lot of history in it. So since I'm assuming you come from the Hindi speaking background, I have a question for you. Chakka, Mawali और हिजड़ा, इन तीनों का एटिमोलॉजी मुझे बताइए. ये कहाँ से आते हैं? इन वर्ड्स का origin क्या है?
No idea. Tell me, क्या एटिमोलॉजी है? हाँ.
तो पहले मवाली का जो कॉन्सेप्ट है ये ईरान से आता है. ओके. मवाली का जो कॉन्सेप्ट है ये ईरान से आता है. ओके. ये इसलिए ईरान से आता है that when Arabs invaded Iran and they converted the Persians to Islam, the Persians had to attach themselves to an Arab master to have social standing, to have social recognition. That particular system was called Mawali, and the system was called Mawala, and the Persian guy was called Mawali. Okay, Mawali का मतलब है second grade human being and second grade citizen. ठीक है, तो ये है उसका origin. तो obviously ये भारत की संस्कृति से तो ये नहीं आया मवाली. ठीक है. दूसरा, आप मुझे ये बताइए, हिजड़ा, ये आपको शुद्ध हिंदी से आया लगता है या फिर किसी और भाषा से ही आया है आपके हिसाब से? ये तो शुद्ध हिंदी का कोई
वर्ड लगता नहीं. हाँ. Sounds not that.
Is not from शुद्ध हिंदी at all.
हाँ.
Okay.
हाँ.
It comes from Urdu. It comes Arabic. Let people decide their own. They come to their own conclusions. Okay. So the point I'm trying to make is, modern India is effectively a caricature, a hodgepodge of a lot of impacts and consequences that have crept into the culture over a significant period of time. And इसको reverse कैसे करते हैं? You have to learn from the Israeli experience, because the first thing that they did was to invest in education, was to change the mindset of the people through education. Hebrew was almost a dead language when the state of Israel was sought to be established between 1920 and 1948. There was a huge movement within the Jewish community, the international Jewry, for revival of Hebrew. In fact, it was one person who started it, who was branded a crackpot by the rest of the Jewish community, by the way. Okay? And by the time he died, Hebrew had been adopted as the national language and had been introduced in schools. That is the point. Okay?
Right.
All of this ultimately goes back to education, because education is effectively the reason for the building block of your head space. So there is a beautiful concept that is accepted in psychology and as well as in jurisprudence, which is there is something called as pure reason and there is something called as adulterated reason, or let's say reason that you get from the rest of the world. प्योर रीजन का मतलब ये होता है that जब आप पैदा होते हैं, आपके अंदर जो बेसिक फिल्टर होता है वो दुनिया से प्रभावित नहीं है. Whatever you are born with as a filter as a person, independent of any conditioning from the rest of the world or even your family, is pure reason. Whereas when the family and the society starts teaching you a few things, it cuts reason, it adds to your reason. Okay, it corrupts or at least it adds. What the biggest form of adding to that pure reason is what your family teaches you and what your education teaches you. So I'm saying that acquired reason is largely a product of education and what the values that are imparted to you by the family. Okay. The one thing that I strongly believe in is that the best way to test whether my hypothesis is utopian, is ideal, is unworkable and practical is by changing the textbook curriculum. Okay. Now, if you change the manner in which education is imparted in India and the production of knowledge systems in India, I am asking myself, is it too far-fetched to basically say that education has an impact on the kind of people the society faces and the society itself? If not, what is the point of education, right? The reason why we invest in education so much is because we believe it will have an impact on society, okay?
Right.
Imagine, assume for a moment that you're a judge who has done his master's in law in jurisprudence from Oxford or from, let's say, Yale or Stanford. And I am trying to present to you the validity of Sabarimala as a practice, and I'm trying to explain to you the traditions that we believe in, and I'm trying to explain to you the worldview of the Indic position. You're educated in Oxford, you're educated in Cambridge. Why would you have any respect for my way of life? Why would you have any concern for my way of life? Why would you have any belief or even some dignity for my way of life? You're bound to look at it as a savage practice. You're bound to look at it from the standpoint of, let's say, male chauvinism and patriarchy, because that is the basic foundation of the Abrahamic worldview, not the Indic worldview. Okay? So all the movements that you have needed are movements that you have needed in the West to counter toxic masculinity that comes as a product of Abrahamism, not because of my religion, not because of my culture, not because of my civilization. Feminism has its origins in those societies where Abrahamism has effectively believed that a woman is secondary to a man, is inferior to a man, that she is only the product of sex and she is a creature of sex and she is a fundamentally promiscuous creature. That is not the Indian worldview, right? So all of this ultimately traces and goes back to the question of education. So the best way to test out whether my position has any validity is to at least see if a generation comes out differently because of a different form of education. Okay? Because you see, if people like me and people like Ashish have managed to survive the education system because of access to other sources,
right?
Imagine what kind of a society you will produce if our worldview becomes effectively the mainstream form of education. Then my position becomes the normal. You become the outlier, right?
Right.
So, ek to Jesai, what a passionate guy. The way he speaks, passionate. Like he knows what he's talking about. He knows where to emphasize, whatnot. मैं अभी दोबारा थोड़ा stun हो गया सुनते हुए इसको. But see what a meaningful question does. All I asked was 1 or 2 questions. This carried on for 10 minutes. Over 10 minutes rather. And it would have carried on more. I just had to egg him. Because the guy is warmed up. वो गरम है. The question hit him. The question is meaningful. और एक good symptom to understand if a question hit somebody or not is वो कहाँ गया इसको आंसर करने के लिए. ईरान, Israel, history, Abrahamism, feminism, sexuality, Nizam. Like he went all these places because he's actively thinking about the answer. He's bringing those pieces together. And the obvious effect is that he's warmed up for the next question. He's warmed up to become deeper friends with me. He's going to stay in the conversation longer. He's going to remember me better. Simple as that. Simple as that.